But first, good on the Prime Minister Scott Morrison for his never-ever rejection of a carbon tax should the government make any move towards a target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050.
Our goal is to reach net zero emissions as soon as possible and preferably by 2050. But when we get there, whether in Australia or anywhere else, that will depend on the advances made in science and technology needed to commercially transform not just advanced economies and countries, but the developing world as well.
I just hope, though, that in conceding that preferably he'd like to reach net zero emissions by 2050, the Prime Minister does not get sucked into another one of the left's games. Now, I don't need to tell you that the left is brilliant at declaring feel-good goals that are Trojan horses for other things, I might add, but terrible at telling us exactly what these holy grails might mean. For the obvious reason that once you spell out the details, people don't want to or can't pay the price. Now, in terms of what it actually means as a commitment, we've got to assume that net zero emissions means first, minimising Australia's production of carbon dioxide and second, offsetting any CO2 that we still produce. Hence the pressure to close coal-fired power stations. Currently, I might remind people, 70% of Australia's electricity supply. To minimise gas-fired power stations, even though, of course, the PM says he wants a gas-fired-led economic recovery, and over time to move to all electric cars and trucks, even to reduce meat consumption, because our animal herds are the major source of Australia's emissions generated by agriculture. Now, under the net zero scenario, any emissions still left after this pretty radical transformation would have to be offset by a giant money-go-round carbon market, meaning the purchase of carbon credits here or more likely abroad, all designed, of course, to make bankers rich and give fraudsters a new income stream. At least that's certainly been the experience of similar schemes in the past in the EU. Now, the only country in the world that's made a serious attempt to cost the economic transition required by a move to net zero emissions by 2050 is New Zealand, where a recent government report estimated that such a target could reduce GDP by between 5 and 16%, even with New Zealand's agriculture sector exempted. Now, is it any wonder that Labor refused to even try to cost its 2019 election commitment to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030? Yet here they are now, 2030 couldn't be costed, but they're pushing a 2050 bandwagon and still not a number anywhere, is there? What, is that an inability to add up? Climate arrogance? Or a fear perhaps of what the numbers will look like that's got them hiding from the truth? Maybe it's a bit of all three. What I do know is that what a coalition government does in terms of climate change is never enough for the Green left, even when commitments are met. Here's the Greens leader in the House of Representatives today, hit with a bit of a reality check from the PM.
Will you now lift Australia's 2030 targets before Joe Biden's April 22 summit and join the rest of the world in fighting what the President says is an existential threat? Or will you stick with your paltry 2030 targets that are based on Australia warming by over 4 degrees and becoming largely uninhabitable during our children's lifetimes?
The way we will beat them will not be by any other method other than ensuring that we are investing in the technological changes that are necessary to continue to successfully transform our economy. Now, not just our economy, because as indeed Special Envoy Biden said, the United States could cut their emissions to zero tomorrow and it wouldn't solve the problem. Mr Speaker, what we need around the world is the technological transformation that has as bigger impact in this country and the United States and Europe and the United Kingdom that it can also have in China, in India, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, Mr Speaker.
Targets set, targets met. Yet it's clear, isn't it, that the Green left want to move the goalposts. It's not good enough that Australia is on track to do what we said we would do by 2030, having already met earlier commitments and more than meeting those commitments. Well, doing what we said we'd do now is suddenly not good enough. Here's the pot plant from Melbourne again.
On relevance, the question wasn't how or whether the targets are going to be met. It was whether the 2030 targets are going to be lifted, and the Prime Minister has not addressed that.
Seriously? Is this where we're at, with the PM now in the gun for meeting his commitments, not missing them, for Australia doing precisely what it said it would do? Instead, that's not good enough. The socialists, well, they want everything upped. More subsidies to pay for the green activism, more jobs sent offshore, and presumably everybody else forced onto a greater dependency on the state. Surely voters can see where all of this is headed. Even though Australia has reduced its emissions by 13% since 2005, mostly under coalition governments, we're allowing foreigners to treat us as climate change pariahs. Where's our self-respect? I mean, are we seriously prepared to cop these lectures given so much hypocrisy elsewhere? Take Jacinda Ardern. She's still the left's great climate change messiah, even though New Zealand's emissions went up by 4%. Likewise, Justin Trudeau, well, style over substance there, isn't it? But for all his lecturing, Canada's emissions fell by only 2%. Remember, Australians have fallen by 13%, and our resource-heavy economies, Australia and Canada, well, they've got a lot in common. The one thing you've got to understand by this climate religion is it's not what you do, but what you say. For instance, who criticises China, which is always attacking the West on climate change, always making big, grand promises, even though its emissions have increased by 70% since 2005? And whoever holds the climate alarmists to account for their false predictions of doom and catastrophe, like Tim Flannery's prediction that our dams would never be full again. The Prime Minister was spot on yesterday that these targets are meaningless bits of paper unless we understand in dollar terms what it means to get there. But climate policy has never been an area where the left try to win the argument based on the science. Science of climate, yes, science of climate, plus the science of economics, or the accounting balance sheets that must add up. In what could be an election year this year, Scott Morrison will likely have plenty of wet Liberal colleagues telling him just to make the net zero emissions commitment. What does it matter, they'll say? It's nearly 30 years away. Just say it, Scott, move on, and then we'll hammer Labor for wanting to bring it about via a tax rather than technology. To do that, to set a target you've no idea what it will cost to meet, would be a big mistake, because once any hard and fast target is enshrined, the Canberra bureaucracy will take it as a holy writ. And even coalition governments end up running on Labor's agenda. That's what's happened on this climate issue to date. Over the past 26 years, Labor's only won majority government once. That's right, just once. Meaning the coalition's been in power for much of the past 3 decades, but despite quiet Australians voting one way, the machine in Canberra moves inexorably in the other direction. Net zero 2050, that's the left's big play for this year. And if the coalition gives it to them without knowing exactly how much it costs and how to pay for it, it just highlights the way the left keeps winning the culture war, even though the left keeps losing elections.